So here we are, last Sunday together. You don't care? Feel the love. Yeah, I know, it's all right, don't worry about it. Stop, forget it's too late. So it's been a week of goodbyes, in the last service it was, kind of very, a goodbye-ish kind of thing happened. And the staff had like a lunch for me on Wednesday, and they kind of roasted me. They gave me things that I'll use the rest of my life. They gave me a tin of mints from Starbucks because I always have these. They gave me a bottle of Ethos water so that, because I always have one up here. They gave me pens because if you're in a meeting with me and you bring a pen, I will steal it from you. And they gave me a new blue shirt, which I wear today. It's kind of nice, don't you think? It's, as we say in my family, striped, which has a slimming effect, yes? Right? Which is very nice, and I appreciate that. I got a lot of love from student ministry, if we could show that slide. My car never looked as good as it did, wrapped in saran wrap and toilet paper that you paid for. God's money going to waste right there. So I wrote a letter to an email to the board and also one to the staff, telling them a lot of things about how much I've learned from them and how good it's been for me to be here, for my family to be here these last 13 months. And I said it's bittersweet. I'm sad to be leaving, but I'm excited for your future. And I think it's good that it's bittersweet because I think that means over the last 13 months we've done the right things and arrived at the right place for Jesse to show up. He comes to town tomorrow, and he'll be here next Sunday. So enough with the goodbyes. Let's talk about something else. So last week, if you were here, we looked at Jonathan and his armor bearer in 1 Samuel 13 and 14. And Jonathan and his armor bearer were discontent to sit out the war between the Israelites and the Philistines like the rest of the army and King Saul did under the safety of the pomegranate trees. These guys were gamers. They were discontent to sit on the sidelines as the Israelites, God's chosen people, were under the thumb of the hated and ungodly Philistines. Jonathan and his armor bearer were gamers. They put their faith into action. They said, you know what, let's go up and get these Philistines and maybe God will help us. And God did. God totally helped them. God saw that they took the risk. They entered into the danger. They didn't know how it was going to work out for them, but they knew that there was a divine moment staring them in the face, and they had to do something about it, and they did. And God met their faith. God met their willingness to put their faith into action, and in a way that only God can, supernaturally, God intervened and won the day for Israel. It got crazy. If you read 1 Samuel 13 and 14, the Israelites actually started killing each other just because Jonathan and his armor bearer recognized the divine moment that was right in front of them and seized it because they had to, because they were gamers. And that's what God longs for each one of us to be, a gamer, somebody who is willing to step into the unknown, the uncertain, into the danger for the sake of advancing the gospel, for the sake of the people around us, not knowing how it's going to work out, not sure that it's going to work out really well for us, hoping that perhaps, as Jonathan said, God's supernatural ability will match our willingness to put our faith into action, and God will do something extraordinary. Seizing the divine moments of our lives is being willing to risk everything and follow Jesus into a life that Mike Yaconelli, before he died, used to call a life of dangerous wonder. As you go forward, as this church goes forward from here, may we be known as people who live our lives, who live lives of dangerous wonder. We all want our lives to count for something, don't we? At the end of our lives, if we have the opportunity to look back and see what we've accomplished in our lives, we want to be able to say we've done something. We've left our mark, right? Our lives have counted for something. We all would hope that our lives have been marked by greatness at the end of our lives. Not necessarily that everybody knew us or that we were famous or that everybody knew our name like at Cheers, but that we did something significant with our life. Not popularity, but profound significance. Greatness in the life of a follower of Jesus is marked by a willingness to completely surrender our lives, our physical lives, our spiritual lives, our emotional lives, all of that to Jesus, everything to Jesus. And there are times where I've been better at that than others, for sure. And greatness in the life of a follower of Jesus is also marked by a willingness to move and to take action when movement and action are the very things that are required of us. And those times are when we see those divine moments just right staring us in the face, calling us to move in their direction. So this morning, we're going to move from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We're going to look at two separate interactions that Jesus had with James and John, two of his disciples who also happen to be brothers. The first interaction is found in Mark 10 and Matthew 20. The second one is in Matthew 26. In the first interaction, James and John, in their intense ambition, almost demand that Jesus give each of them positions of, in fact, they ask, but it's more of a demand, that Jesus give them powers or positions of power and prestige in his kingdom. And as they ask this for just the two of them, they're pretty much saying the other 10 guys are not as great as us. We should be at your right and at your left. So they're kind of stepping on their friends. And in their self-serving ambition, they wanted greatness on their terms, the way that they would define it, the way they expected it to come. And it'd be really easy to say, wow, James and John, they were prideful, they were selfish. But as I look at them, I see a lot of myself in these guys. And as we look at them, I think we see a lot of ourselves in these two guys. The second interaction between James and John is in Matthew 26 in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before Jesus goes to the cross. And this is where these two brothers let Jesus down when he needed them the most. But here, before we get to that, if we are people who give ourselves fully to Jesus and choose to live in what I'll call intimate proximity to Jesus, we'll be in the best position we could possibly be for God to accomplish his purposes in and through our lives. And that's exactly where Jesus wants us to live. It's where he calls us to live. It's a dangerous place to live, intimate proximity to Jesus. That's where our lives can really count for something significant. It's where we live when we're willing to get in the game and move in God's direction so that he might take our ordinary lives and accomplish something extraordinary through us. And we're in a divine moment, a defining moment as a church. We're in a moment of profound opportunity as we switch from my time to Jesse's time here, which will extend for years, I believe. And this new season starts, when he hits the ground. And by the way, buckle up, because when he hits the ground, man, he's going for it. It's going to be a wild ride, and it will be a good one. But it's going to take all of you, all of us, embracing what God wants us to do. It's going to require us to get in the game, to be part of it. Will you do that? Will we determine not to be sideliners? Will we determine to be gamers who get in the game? There's a song by the band Switchfoot. It came out about 10 years ago that describes where a lot of people are at and have been, and where this church has been for a number of years. Here's what it says. The song says, everyone's here. Everybody's watching you now. Everybody waits for you now. What happens next? What happens next? I dare you to move. I dare you to move. Welcome to the fallout. Welcome to resistance. The tension is here between who you are and who you could be, between how it is and how it should be. I dare you to move. I dare you to move. That's the moment we're living in, and the tension between where we are and where we could be, between how it is and how it should be. Will we move? Will we move off the sidelines? Will we get in the game? Will we live in close proximity, dangerous proximity to Jesus? Will we be people who, as we said last week, are dancers who dance upon the injustices that rage all around us? Will we be among the few that truly follow Jesus, or will we find our place among the masses who are content to sit it out on the sidelines in safety? This is the choice where so many would-be followers of Jesus check out. Like James and John, they want these Christians or so-called Christians or want to be followers of Jesus. Like James and John, they want all the benefits of a relationship with Jesus, but none of the risk, none of the danger, none of the sacrifice, none of the pain. These are people who want to live in that fictional place that says the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. And I said last week, it's not. That's not true. The safest place is to be under the pomegranate tree. The safest place to be is on the sideline. It's also the worst place to be. The best place to be is in the center of God's will, but it's also the most dangerous place to be, because people who've lived in the center of God's will have sacrificed. People who've lived in the center of God's will have suffered. But people who live in the center of God's will in dangerous proximity to Jesus have also experienced wonder. They've experienced purpose that they never would have experienced in their life if not for living in that dangerous proximity, if not for living a life of dangerous wonder in the center of God's will. But people who are unwilling to live there and who believe that, oh, I'll just live in the center of God's will, this safe place, they draw a line, a circle around Jesus that they never enter into. It's a line where they're far enough from Jesus that they can hear him and know about him, but he can't really reach their lives. They don't allow it. And they don't ever allow his relentlessly tender love to catch up to them, to reach them. So they know about Jesus, they hear about Jesus, but they never really experience what a relationship with Jesus is all about. They never enter into the danger. They never get close to him, close enough to him for him to touch their lives and for them to realize that, wow, what was I doing on the other side of that line? This is where life is. And while it may cost me something, while I may have to risk something, I would have it no other way. Because that's what life is all about. And so when people draw that line, the result in the church then becomes, there's an old story that you probably heard if you've been in church for any period of time, but on the East Coast there was a certain spot where there were rocks out, well out into the water, and there wasn't a lighthouse, and boats kept crashing on it, and so somebody decided they would create a life-saving station for people who were shipwrecked, and they created that station, they rescued people, and they got so many people who were rescued that got cleaned up and taken care of that all of a sudden at one point they decided, you know what, we don't want any more dirty, slimy, wet, shipwrecked people coming in here, because now this has become kind of our home, a place just for us. And so another shipwreck station or life-saving station was set up down the beach, and then another and another and another, because history repeated itself again and again and again. And that happens in the church. The church, which is meant to be a life-giving and life-saving station for real people who matter deeply to Jesus, a lot of times they become members-only clubs where not everybody's welcome. And its mission is no longer to rescue shipwrecked lives, but to make its members as comfortable as possible. That is not where this church is headed. That is not what this church is about. We have to leave the stuff that doesn't matter, the stuff that has no eternal significance. We have to leave that stuff behind so we can follow Jesus on this crazy, dangerous adventure that he's called each one of us to as individuals, and that he's called us together to as a church. And we must move, as Switchfoot says, and we have to get in the game as individuals and as a church. So in their first interaction with Jesus, James and John they're on the safe side of that line. They're not living in dangerous proximity to Jesus. They're living in close proximity to Jesus, but not dangerous proximity to him. These were two of Jesus' closest friends, but they didn't totally get it yet. And even though they were guys who were living on the leading edge of a revolutionary movement that would change the world and change eternity, they didn't understand. These were guys that wanted all the benefits of their association with Jesus, but none of the cost, right? They wanted power and position without having to ever surrender, without having ever to sacrifice, without ever having to feel pain. And this, by the way, is way too often true in my own life, and probably in yours too. Mark 10:35 says, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do us a favor. In your glorious kingdom, we want to sit in places of honor next to you,' they said, 'one at your right hand and the other at your left.'" I think they both wanted the right. We're going to work that out later. The amazing thing about this interaction is that it takes place just after Jesus has told them what's going to happen to him. That they're going to go to Jerusalem and that he's going to suffer and die. And he tells them that being followers of him is about living a life of significance, not about living a life of selfish ambition. It's about surrender and sacrifice. Instead of climbing your way to the top over your friends, over your 10 other disciples, it's about serving your friends and giving your life for your friends. Jesus said, if you want to be great in my kingdom, then give up your selfish ambition, take up your cross, and follow me. Look at Matthew 16:24. So how could James and John be so close to Jesus and get it so wrong, especially in light of what Jesus told them. And this is what he said, Matthew 20, verse 18. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die. Then they will, and he's talking about himself and they knew it. Then they will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, flogged with a whip, and crucified. But on the third day, he will be raised from the dead. Good news at the end, right? But what Jesus has been telling his followers is so disturbing that nobody wants to walk with Jesus. Nobody wants to hear the things that Jesus is telling them. So he's speaking to them while he's walking out here, and they're all kind of back here going, I don't know what to do with what he's saying. It wasn't what they wanted. It wasn't what they expected from Jesus. Mark 10:32, they were now on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking ahead of them, and the disciples were filled with fear and dread, and the people following behind them were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him in Jerusalem. Now, they might not have done it. The disciples may not have done this physically, but emotionally, they're like, whoa, we can't hear this. You'd think that followers of Jesus, especially his disciples, would start pondering what he was saying to them, that they would start to, it would certainly have rocked their world, and you would think that they would start to consider how this is going to impact their lives and what it's going to mean for them after all this goes down. But it appears that maybe James and John are at that first stage of kind of taking in this information, denial, They're in a little bit of denial. Otherwise, how could they make such a request after Jesus had just told them what's going to happen to him? Matthew 20, verses 20 through 23 is just an awesome passage because it says this. Then the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons, and she knelt respectfully to ask a favor. What's your request? Jesus asked. She replied, in your kingdom will you let my two sons sit in places of honor to you, next to you, one at your right and the other at your left. Now, I want to make a couple observations about this little passage. Matthew wrote it, right? And Matthew was one of the guys that James and John was willing to climb on top of or disregard in order to be two of the greatest of the 12 disciples. The other 10 didn't matter, and Matthew was one of them. And Matthew apparently still held a grudge because he includes that their mom came to Jesus when some of the other Gospels don't include that. He wants everybody to know that these guys are a couple of mama's boys who had their mom come to Jesus and ask them if they could be in positions of power, while the other 10 were just whatever. So you can check that out with your local theologian, but that's my take on that. It doesn't speak well for sure of James and John that their mom went to Jesus on their behalf. Has your mom ever interceded for you? It's really never good when your mom intercedes for you. It's never a good deal. Like if you're in trouble and your mom takes up your cause and goes to your friends and says, hey, you should treat my kid better. Never good. Never good. At first service, I told a story about it. I can't tell it. Never mind. My family's here. So I'll tell a different story. So when I was 18 or 19, I can't remember how old we were, I had two close friends, Mike and Sean, in Chicago, and we all had cars. I had the worst one. Sean had this Subaru Brat. It was kind of this cool little Subaru truck that they used to make, and he had wrecked it, and we went to, and they fixed it, and it was just beautiful and pristine and put back together, really nice, and so he decides he's going to drive alone. I didn't like driving with Sean because Sean would actually pass people on the inside across the yellow line on the freeway and not care about the life sitting next to him, which often was mine. So I didn't like riding with him in the car. So I rode with Mike because Mike also had a Trans Am, which was a super cool car, like the Smokey and the Bandit kind of Trans Am, the really cool one. So we're riding, and we're all listening to the same radio station because it's the one we always listen to, and a Paula Abdul song came on, and it's like, wait, don't tell me, and so that part came on, and Sean is driving ahead of us in his little Subaru Brat, and when Paul is singing, wait, he turns the wheel, like, wait, don't, and it's winter in Chicago, he hits ice, he spins out, does a couple of 360s, and the only thing that stops him is this huge railroad tie coming out of the ground that is holding up the mailbox of a True Value hardware store. So he smashes into the car was like awesome for 5 minutes, and he smashes into this thing, and the impact smashed the passenger side window completely, and it actually was such an intense, it hit with such intense force that glass from that window was embedded in his backside, in his butt, right? So in his back. So what does he do? He calls his mom. calls his mom. She brings tweezers and the first aid kit, right? Come on, we're 18, 19 years old. We could have figured this out. But I stayed to watch. So his mom comes. They go in the bathroom of True Value Hardware, and everybody in that place could hear his mom telling him what an idiot he was for driving like a fool while she's tweezering the pieces of glass out of his butt, and he's screaming, "Ow, Mom, that hurts! Ow, Mom, that hurts!" When your mom intervenes, it's never a good deal, man. It is never a good deal. It's embarrassing when you're a kid when your mom intervenes. Imagine being a disciple of Jesus and having your mom intervene and make such a misguided, selfish request on your behalf while totally alienating your 10 closest friends. In fairness to James and John, we should back up for a minute and say that as misguided as they were, as misguided as their mother may have been, they had good intentions. They believe in Jesus. They believe that he's the Savior of the world, but good intentions are just that. Good intentions will hardly change a life. Good intentions will certainly not change the world, and that's what God had called James and John to do, to change their life and then to be people who change the world as they advance the gospel. And like a lot of people then and like a lot of people now, James and John didn't fully understand what following Jesus required. They didn't fully understand what Jesus was calling them to. In their minds, Jesus wasn't supposed to be a suffering Messiah, as he was explaining to them. He wasn't supposed to die on a cross. He was supposed to be a king who was going to overthrow the Romans and get rid of the religious establishment and set up his own government that would reign forever. And they wanted positions of power. They wanted to be governor and prime minister to King Jesus, right? Then verse 22, but Jesus told them, "You don't know what you're asking." And they didn't. Then he asked this great question, "Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of sorrow that I am about to drink?" And their answer, "Oh yes, we are. We are able," they replied. Total denial on their part. And then Jesus said, "You will indeed drink from it, but I have no right to say who will sit on the thrones next to mine. My Father has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." As we'll see in a few minutes, drinking from this cup would mean giving their lives for the cause of Christ so that the world might know Jesus. It would be for them moving off the sidelines that they were so comfortable in and getting in the game where they could enter into the danger and enter into the risk where they were willing to give everything in order to follow Jesus and advance his cause. And the question that Jesus asked James and John is a question for each one of us in the room. Are you capable? And we certainly are capable, but will we choose to drink from the bitter cup of sorrow that Jesus had to drink from? Will we follow him that much? Will we live lives of dangerous wonder? Will we live our lives being gamers, or will we live our lives, live out our days in profound insignificance? Which will it be? These guys, James and John, they had their chance to take the cup just a few nights later in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew 26, verse 36 says this, "Then Jesus brought them to an olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, 'Sit here while I go ahead to pray.' And he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John," hit the kind of inner circle for Jesus. "And he began to be filled with anguish and deep distress, and he told them, 'My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and watch with me.'" And Jesus knew that the cross was right around the corner for him. He knew what was going to happen. Yet again, we see the very human side of Jesus in these passages. In his moment of truth, Jesus was the one in need. He needed his friends to be there for him. He needed his friends to watch out for him. He needed his friends to pray for him, to support him. And as much as we'd like to believe that the center of God's will is the safest place to be, following Jesus and being in the center of God's will rarely leaves us unscathed. It didn't leave Jesus unscathed. Stephen, if you read in Acts 6 and 7, he was stoned to death for proclaiming the message of Jesus, and a guy named Saul, who would later become Paul, oversaw that. Hebrews 11 is a passage that is full of people who didn't come out unscathed when they entered into the danger and lived in the center of God's will. These nameless men and women of faith who chose significance over safety, gamers, they chose to be gamers instead of sideliners. Hebrews 11 says in verse 35, these people, they trusted God and were tortured, preferring to die rather than turn from God and be free. So they would rather be in the game than be on the sidelines where it was safe. They placed their hope in the resurrection to a better life. Some were mocked and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in dungeons. Some died by stoning and some were sawed in half. Others were killed with a sword. Some went about in skins of sheep and goats, hungry and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world. But the world didn't seem to think so. But God knew it. They wandered over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All of these people we have mentioned received God's approval because of their faith. And these are the people that if we have a chance to interview them on the other side of this life, they would say, I wouldn't do it any other way. I would still enter into the danger, even if I got sawed in half for doing it. There was only one way for Jesus to go. In his case, he knew how the story would end. But it only made it harder for Jesus, knowing what was in advance, which is, I said this last week. That's why God doesn't give us our future, because he doesn't reveal it to us. He only kind of gives us, steps along the way. If we knew exactly what was going to happen to us, we might collapse under the weight of it. And Jesus was collapsing under the weight of knowing what was going to happen to him. Yet, verse 39 of Matthew 26, he went on a little farther and fell face down on the ground, praying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will, not mine. This was as real as it gets. Jesus is afraid. He doesn't want to feel the pain of abandonment. He doesn't want to feel the pain of betrayal. He doesn't want to feel the pain of being tortured or nailed to a cross. He doesn't want to feel the pain of death. So he says to God, is there any other way? But not my way, but your will be done. This is inner tension that was raging in the soul of Jesus. And long before that dark night in his life, Jesus had told his followers there could be no other way. John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. And which meant that Jesus had to go to the cross. He had to give his life so then God could give his life, what Jesus' life offered to us. Verse 40, then he returned to his disciples and found them asleep, and he said to Peter, couldn't you stay awake and watch with me even 1 hour? Keep alert and pray, otherwise temptation will overpower you. For though the spirit is willing enough, the body is weak. Again he left and prayed, my Father, if this cup cannot be taken away until I drink it, your will be done. That's the same cup that he's talking about drinking that he was saying to James and John. Can you drink this cup that I'm about to drink from? Are you willing to suffer and sacrifice? Are you willing to enter into the danger with me? He returned to them again and found them sleeping, for they just couldn't keep their eyes open. So he went back to pray a third time, saying the same things again. Then he came to the disciples and said, still sleeping, still resting? Look, my time has come. I, the Son of Man, am betrayed into the hands of sinners. Let's be going. See, my betrayer is here. And Jesus surrendered himself to the will of his Father, and in doing so, you and I have a chance to enter into a relationship with Jesus. We have a chance to experience the purpose and significance that our lives were meant to know. Jesus is arrested, he's beaten, he's convicted of a crime that was kind of trumped up. He's traded like a baseball card for a murderer named Barabbas, and he's nailed to a tree. He's buried, then 3 days, or cross. He's buried, then 3 days later, God conquers sin and death by bringing Jesus back to life, offering eternity to lost and broken, notorious sinners and shipwrecked people like you and me. And it wasn't until Jesus went to the cross and then came back again that James and John and the other disciples realized the significance of their calling. Jesus passed them the cup, and they ultimately took it, and they drank the dregs of it. Somebody gave me a glass of wine the other night. It was at the bottom of the bottle, and it actually had dregs in it. And I was thinking, hey, and I showed Kara. I'm like, hey, I got the dregs. I'm talking about that on Sunday. Maybe it's a God thing. I should drink more of that wine. I don't know. Shouldn't talk about wine. I know. My last day. It's all right. So it wasn't until Jesus came back to life that they took that cup and drank it to the dregs. James, John, and the other 9 apostles, Judas opted out, as we all know. They became gamers. They became passionate about following Jesus and advancing his purpose and his cause. They were different once they understood who Jesus really was and what following him really meant. They gave everything to seize the divine moments that came their way, so that everyone who matters deeply to God might know the story of Jesus. And they absolutely gave all that they were and all that they had. They left nothing back in order to advance the gospel, and they never regretted it. And if we have a chance to interview them, that's what they'll say. I would do the same thing over. I may not ask for the It's embarrassing that we asked and our mom came and asked. We probably wouldn't do that again, but on the other side of Jesus' resurrection, we wouldn't change a thing. Wouldn't change a thing. John lived out his life telling others about his experience with Jesus, and then ultimately was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. He lived out his years there. John took the cup that Jesus gave him and he drank it. All the disciples did. In Acts 12:2, James literally gave his life for the cause of Christ. King Herod Agrippa had him killed because James would not shut up about Jesus. And King Herod Agrippa just couldn't take it anymore, so he had him killed with a sword. This was the same James who demanded to sit at the right or the left of Jesus. This was the same James who had selfish ambition driving him until he understood who Jesus really was, what Jesus really did for him, and what his calling in life really was. To enter into the danger, not to have power and position, but to make a difference in the world. And that's what John and James and every one of the disciples, except for Judas, did. And they would have it no other way. The cup was different for each one of these guys. They each had to step into their own mystery. They each had to enter their own risk and dangerous wonder. For Jesus, it was the cross. For James, it was Herod. For John, it was exile and isolation. And the cup is different and unique for each one of us as well. The question is, will we take that unique cup that Jesus offers us, and will we drink from it? Can we? Certainly we can. Have we? Absolutely, many of us have. Will we again? Will we now? Take the cup and drink from it. Will we choose to be a gamer? Will we choose dangerous wonder, risk, mystery, and significance over the safe and predictable? Will we choose all those things, wonder, risk, danger, over a nice, safe religious experience that leaves our souls longing for far more? Will we give our lives, as James and John ultimately did, to the cause of Jesus? When I first got here 13 months ago, or first started talking with this church in August of last year, I think a lot of people in this church felt a little bit like the disciples did when Jesus was telling them all the bad things that were going to happen, but then something good would happen. I don't think they heard that last part. I think they just heard all the bad stuff. And when I came into this church, there were people who were tired, people who were bummed out, if not depressed, people who were confused and feeling a bit overwhelmed because of all of the things that had happened in the life of this church over the last many years. A lot of things had changed in the life of this church over a relatively short period of time, and a lot of you were feeling disoriented and vulnerable. The staff was certainly feeling disoriented and vulnerable. I remember being in meetings where people were saying, hey, the church is dying, and, we may not make it, and we may be insolvent, we may not have any money to pay the bills, and we might not be here in another month. And I said, that could all be true. If we just sit here and wait for it to happen, it will likely be true. But if we have the ability to affect our own future with God's help, so why don't we try that and see what happens? And we tried that, and it took about 6 months for the staff to say, you know what, it's fun to do ministry again. And that's when I thought, you know what, God's really turning the ship, and that's a good thing. There was a time when a lot of us were wondering whether the best days in the life of our church were behind us. And I think if we've learned anything in the last 13 months, we've learned that the best days are not behind us. They are just in front of us. They're just in front of you. And I'll say not but. They are just in front of you as we, not we, because I'm leaving, but you, as you enter the danger, as you become more and more willing to seize those divine moments that stare you in the face, as you become unwilling to let injustice go without doing something about it, as you're willing to be a person who lives a life of dangerous wonder, your future and the future of this church is a great one. It's a dangerous one. It's an uncertain one, but it's a great one. Because living a life of dangerous wonder is also living a life in the center of God's will is living a life of dangerous wonder. I'll put it that way. So again, profound moment in the life of this church, a divine moment for all of us. Will we do what Jonathan and his armor bearer did? Will we put action to our faith and trust that God's supernatural power will touch that action and do something that only God can do through ordinary people like us? Will we allow Jesus to take us on an unexpected and wonderful journey into the future because we choose to live lives of dangerous wonder, because we choose to be people who are gamers, discontent, uncontented, to live on the sidelines. Switchfoot says, the tension is here between who you are and who you could be, between how it is and how it should be. I dare you to move. I dare you to move.